I'm Rabbi Amy Scheinerman, and it's very good to be with you together for some Jewish learning. The words Manish Tana Halayla Hazeh, how is this night different from all others, will be so very true on Seder night this year in a way most of us perhaps never would have imagined. At our quintessential festival of gathering together around the family table, we are separated and apart, save for the modern blessing of the internet. The magnificent story of the Exodus begins with danger and grows darker and darker yet, but ultimately it moves toward light. As it progresses, it spins off the themes of courage, community, survival, and redemption, and includes lots of plagues. There's plenty here for us to delve into at any time, but especially at this time when many of us could use a boost of courage. I'd like to begin in 1989, not with a plague, but with a meeting. This was a dialogue between the Dalai Lama, the spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, and 6 Jewish scholars. The Dalai Lama was born Tenzin Gyatso in 1940. He was enthroned the 14th Dalai Lama, which, by the way, means ocean of wisdom. Is that not a magnificent title to hold? In 1950, at the age of 15. That same year, Communist China invaded and occupied Tibet. During the 1959 Tibetan uprising, the Dalai Lama fled to India, settled in Dharamsala, where he has lived ever since as a refugee. Some 80,000 Tibetans followed him to Dharamsala. In 1989, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, same year, 1989, he was visiting in the United States and sought a formal dialogue with Jews. What you see on your screen is the New York Times article about that meeting. The Dalai Lama sought the meeting because he had a very specific question for us. How do you survive exile from your land, the place that is the locus of your religion? That, of course, was precisely the predicament the Tibetan Buddhists found themselves in as a result of China's occupation of Tibet. The Dalai Lama said, "We always talk of the Jewish people scattered in so many countries, speaking so many languages. Yet the Jews keep their traditions. It is something very admirable." The Dalai Lama wanted to know, essentially, what is the Jewish secret sauce for survival? How would you have answered the Dalai Lama? While you're pondering your response, I'd like to share with you 5 points that I would have shared with the Dalai Lama. First, we are blessed with a rich tradition of sacred texts that address the universal questions of life: why we are here, what our purpose is, how we should think about evil, how it is best to live our lives, how to live together and among other people in a way that promotes justice and decency, and much more. Second, we have a rich tradition of textual interpretation that encourages learning and extrapolating more and more meaning from our texts to address new questions as they arise. And new questions are always arising. We have the texts and the means to explore and find answers to them. Third, we have a culture of study that makes ample room for disagreement and spirited argument without declaring certain opinions absolutely correct and others blasphemous. Our umbrella is broad. There's room for us all to stand underneath together. Fourth, we have a rich menu of rituals that brings us together and reminds us who we are and how we are connected to one another in both time and space. Our way of seeing ourselves within the ongoing stream of Jewish history connects us to Jews throughout the generations. Jews who held satyrs under all sorts of conditions, even in concentration camps. And Jews all around the globe, everywhere, who celebrate and long for redemption wherever they call home today. The Dalai Lama came to see that the genius of Judaism is that it is fundamentally a home-centered tradition. We are not wholly dependent on a priestly class and a sacred physical structure. We bring together family and friends to live out our traditions, and therefore can carry them with us into exile when necessary and live them fully outside our sacred land. Community, bringing people together, is essential to Judaism and Jewish living. We have been told recently that we are to practice social distancing, but that is precisely what we are not doing, nor should we do. We need to scrupulously practice physical distancing in order to protect ourselves and one another. But the devices so many of us sometimes feel at least a modicum of ambivalence toward, our smartphones and tablets and computers, are now vehicles for connecting us in ways that are wonderful. They bring us together socially. And perhaps the very finest example is Pesach, Passover. The story of the Exodus is universal in nature, and it touches on a dozen universal questions and concerns. Our 2,500 years of interpretation help us see this story as speaking to our lives and our situations, whenever and wherever we find ourselves. We continue to study and extract more and new meanings as we are doing right now. We are all one another's teachers, sharing our insights. Pesach offers us extraordinarily beautiful rituals to express what we've learned and to bind us to one another. We're going to focus in this session on the first chapter and a half of the book of Exodus. The Hebrew name for Exodus is Shemot, names. Indeed, it begins with names. The names of the patriarchal leaders of the 12 tribes who arrived in Egypt in the generation of Jacob, Jacob who was renamed Israel. As we read our story together, please focus on a number of things. First, who are the main characters? Who are the people who act in important and game-changing ways? Second, who is actually named? Whose name do you hear and learn? And third, what is the value system of these primary characters? Starting at the beginning of the book of Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each coming with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. The total number of persons that were of Jacob's issue came to 70, Joseph being already in Egypt. Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the Israelites were fertile and prolific. They multiplied and increased very greatly, so that the land was filled with them. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Joseph had saved Israel from famine, but the new king either did not know the history of his own land and people, or he did not care. What he does care about becomes immediately apparent. And he said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are much too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise from the ground." This Pharaoh, this ruler, sees the world in stark terms, us versus them. If you're not one of us, if you are them, you're either an enemy or a potential enemy, not to be tolerated. And so he sets out a plan to control and exploit the Israelites to the max. So he set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built garrison cities for Pharaoh, Piton, and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. I've included a graphic here for you, a picture of a reconstructed archaeological site of an ancient storehouse, what we think perhaps the storehouses that the Bible is talking about may well have looked like. The Egyptians ruthlessly imposed upon the Israelites the various labors that they made them perform. Ruthlessly, they made life bitter for them with harsh labor at mortar and bricks and with all sorts of tasks in the field. I've included here some images of brickmaking in Egypt. People used a combination of straw and mud. They forced the concoction into molds and then baked it in the hot Egyptian sun. It's quite easy to imagine just how laborious, back-breaking, in fact, and how difficult this work was. And now we meet new characters in the unfolding drama. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, saying, "When you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live." The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They let the boys live. I've highlighted the term Hebrew midwives and provided the Hebrew in red. I want to return to this in a bit, but for now, please note it there. In case you've ever wondered what a birth stool is, I've included here for you two ancient depictions. A birth stool is designed to take full advantage of ergonomics for a woman as she delivers a baby. When he says to look at the birth stool, what he means is the moment the baby emerges, if you see it's a boy, kill it. Two questions for us to ponder at this point. First, is there something surprising about where the story has taken us? Consider this. The first two people named, indeed the only two people named thus far, and when I say that I mean their personal names, are both women. Surprising. Second, why kill the baby boys? It's generally agreed that Pharaoh wants to prevent the Israelites from raising an army. That much is clear. But please consider these commentaries. Midrash Seder Eliyahu Rabbah comments, if they had said to kill the daughters and let the sons live, the Israelite population would have decreased immediately. For it is the way of men, certainly in the ancient world, please understand the context, for it is the way of men to take 10 wives and have many sons circumcised, but it is not the way of women to marry even 2 men. The 15th century biblical commentator Don Isaac Abarbanel agrees, and he goes even further, noting that a better course for Pharaoh would have been to put all the babies to death. But Pharaoh's narrow-sighted approach led him to recognize only the men as a threat, a military threat. He failed to consider the women. In other words, Pharaoh failed to recognize the power and influence of the most vulnerable class of the society, women. If that sounds like a modern take on an ancient story, then I hope we'll have a chance to dive together into the Talmud, because written long before Abarbanel, it goes so far as to say that God redeemed all of Israel from Egypt on account of the women alone. But for now, let's return to the biblical story. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, letting the boys live?" Now, the response of the midwives is nothing short of startling and remarkable. The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come to them, they have given birth." A question. What are Shifra and Puah effectively saying about the Israelites? They are saying that Israelites are biologically different from Egyptians. They're not just religiously different, culturally different, or linguistically different, or even all of the above. They're wholly other, and their otherness includes a different biology. Why would Shifra and Puah make such an outlandish and absurd claim to Pharaoh? Because knowing his worldview, they knew he would buy it, hook, line, and sinker. And indeed, he does. Their ploy effectively buys them time and cover to deliver more baby boys and hide them away from Pharaoh's soldiers. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, God established households for them. God registers powerful approval of them. But paranoid and sociopathic leaders like this Pharaoh do not give up easily, and indeed often do what he does now. Pharaoh conscripts the entire Egyptian population into his scheme, which is now expanded far beyond slavery or indentured servitude, and is now about genocide. Then Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, "Every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, but let every girl live." Pharaoh is focused wholly on his power, at the expense of human lives. This will become increasingly clear when the Egyptians are hit with plague after plague, and throughout, his only concerns are his position, power, and prestige. Torah is providing a clear, unambiguous window into its view of the danger powerful leaders can pose to their own society when their values and priorities are so misaligned with those of God and Torah. Perhaps the parallel today is a focus entirely on the economy over and above the cost of human life. As an example, Larry Kudlow, the National Economic Council Director, on March 23rd expressed the administration's priority in the midst of our current plague of coronavirus. He said, "At some point, you have to ask yourself whether the shutdown isn't doing more harm than good. In economic terms, perhaps even in health terms." The story of the Exodus implores us to consider the worldview, values, and priorities of those in power, and the effect on, well, everyone who benefits from this. And now, we meet several new characters. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child into it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stationed herself at a distance to learn what would befall him. Curiously, Torah doesn't tell us their names, though we know that the father is Amram, the mother is Yocheved, and the sister is Miriam. No mention is made of the older brother Aaron. And one more very important character now enters the story. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile while her maidens walked along the Nile. She spied the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child a boy crying. She took pity on it and said, "This must be a Hebrew child." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter answered, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. What becomes clear is that Miriam has watched Pharaoh's daughter come down to the Nile for her daily baths. She has a good sense of the character of Pharaoh's daughter and trusts that she will save the infant and not turn him over to her father's soldiers. And when Miriam appears out of the reeds, out of the rushes, just as Pharaoh's daughter finds herself with a bawling infant she cannot feed, it is likely that the princess easily discerns the connection between the infant and the girl. Therefore, when the girl offers to get a nursemaid, some woman who would have herself just delivered a child, Pharaoh's daughter understands that the girl is offering to bring the biological mother of the infant and readily agrees to the arrangement. Miriam and Pharaoh's daughter work together in tandem without ever revealing or articulating what is too dangerous to say aloud. And so this part of the story ends with these words. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son. She named him Moses, explaining, "I drew him up out of the water." There are many striking things in this story. I'd like to focus with you on these. Aside from the Pharaoh, who embodies evil and nihilism, the movers and shakers here are all women: Shifra, Puah, Yocheved, Miriam, and Pharaoh's daughter. All 5 women work together in tandem, helping and cooperating toward the end of protecting and nurturing life, despite and behind the back of the paranoid sociopathic Pharaoh who is bent only on genocide. And this brings me to the most telling phrase of the entire story, which I highlighted in red, and I will bring it back for you here. Miladot ha'ivriot, which is generally translated Hebrew midwives. But from the standpoint of Hebrew grammar, there are 2 completely legitimate ways to translate it. First, Miladot ha'ivriot means Hebrew women whose profession is midwife. Second is Egyptian women, Egyptian midwives, who serve the Hebrew women when they give birth. So either they are Hebrew women or they are Egyptian women, and we cannot know which. Why doesn't Torah tell us which meaning it intends and who these women, Shifra and Puah, precisely are? I would suggest to you that Torah is purposefully ambiguous because what it wants us to understand is that it doesn't matter. These people who come from the most powerless class in either society, Egypt or the Hebrew society, these women work together. They don't care who is Hebrew and who is Egyptian. They care about bringing life into the world. They care about nurturing it and protecting it. And they work together to subvert the plans of Pharaoh, and they succeed magnificently. What they do brings God into the picture and into the action, and the ultimate result is that Israel leaves Egypt in a wonderful redemptive exodus of which we, of course, are the beneficiaries, and which we will celebrate on Seder night, as indeed we celebrate it every day in our liturgy. Thank you for this opportunity to share Torah with you, and thank you for sharing this learning with me. I'd like to end our session with a prayer of thanksgiving for the frontline healthcare workers. All those EMTs, doctors, nurses, medical technicians, respiratory therapists, the shifres and puas of our time. We thank them for courageously risking their lives and their welfare to promote and protect the lives of others, to protect us. Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, our God and God of all the generations of our people. Strengthen the hands and hearts of all those who courageously accept enormous risks and steadfastly engage in life-saving work on behalf of all of us. May they be protected from the scourge of this pandemic and return to their families and loved ones whole, healthy, and safe. And may we remain safe and well. And may we scrupulously keep the proper physical distance from one another, but draw near socially by whatever means we can to check on one another, support and encourage one another, and connect together over words of Torah. When we say or hear the words, Manishtana halayla hazeh, how is this night different from all others this year? May we be able to respond, despite the challenge, despite the restrictions, we reached across the divide and made meaningful connections. Amen. And thank you very much.